Hello, everybody. This is Atul Tandon, CEO of Opportunity International, coming to you on this virtual platform. Thanks so much to our friends at Ideagen for organizing the 17 Days of Sustainability here, and both very excited, but as well thankful for this opportunity to speak about SDG number 4, education for all. It's a matter that, of course, for each one of us is close to our hearts. How do we make sure that the next generation, our children, are prepared for the future that lies ahead of them? And we know how important education is in that regard. So today, as we talk about and we come to you, whilst we recognize education is one of the most effective tools to build future income and wealth, and really is the answer, if you've seen even the past 20 to 25 years of history in my own native country of India, places like China, Southeast Asia, and now across the world, is one of the strongest tools to beat back generational poverty. We still are confronted with a situation where 617 million children are getting either no education or inadequate education, something that should not be acceptable to any one of us. To address that problem, my organization, Opportunity International, that for 50 years has helped poor families build sustainable incomes by giving them financial resources, training, and support. So they set up their own businesses or get jobs and get income so they can beat back economic poverty. In the last 10 years, we embarked on a worldwide effort to start to increase the availability of good quality education to the children of those families. And to that end, to start to fund private schools that were providing affordable education at very, very low cost to these children. In that regard, as I look at our numbers, just in the last 10 years, 6.5 million children in 23,000 schools. And just in the last 24 months, have more than doubled that size of that program. So it's scaling very, very fast. You could say that the first few years was spent testing and piloting. Now we've got a model that is ready to scale, and we are in for some rapid scaling, even as I look at our future plans. And we'll talk a bit about what that model is, in just a bit. But as we've been growing our impact, and as schooling has been growing around the world, on comes COVID-19, with a devastating impact, probably beyond the two biggest impacts on the world's poor of the lockdown, beyond the health part, which has been devastating itself, are one, the economic burden of the lockdown. These are daily wage workers. Incomes are lost when marketplaces are closed. As a result, increasing hunger across the world, as the UN's been talking about. The second and the most dramatic impact is that schools have been closed. Starting at about 6 months back when the lockdown started, about 90% of the world's children were out of school. Since the start of schooling, and specifically public education and the provision of large-scale education, probably the first event of its kind that so many children were out of school. The UN Secretary General, and this is, I quote, "A generational catastrophe that could waste untold human potential, undermine decades of progress, and exacerbate entrenched inequalities." It was his description of the impact of COVID-19. 275 global leaders writing to the G20, the IMF, World Bank, and to national governments had this to say: with over 1 billion children are still out of school because of the lockdown, there is now a real and present danger that the public health crisis will create a COVID generation who will lose out on schooling and whose opportunities are permanently damaged. While the more fortunate have had access to alternatives, the world's poorest children have been locked out of learning, denied internet access, and with the loss of free school meals, once a lifeline for 300 million boys and girls, hunger has grown. An immediate concern as we bring the lockdown to an end is the fate of an estimated 30 million children who, according to UNESCO, may never return to school. For these, the world's least advantaged children, education is often the only escape from poverty, a route that is in danger of closing. Many of these children are adolescent girls for whom being in school is the best defense against forced marriage and the best hope for the life of expanded opportunity. So here we are to discuss these matters. It is grave and it doesn't probably get graver. To discuss these matters and the creative solutions that the humanitarian community, all of us put together, have been thinking of how to address this problem that has been evolving. I'm excited to have two very able colleagues and people who have been in this business for a while join me. Tressa Johnson, who comes from the East Coast and is the Director of Education at the Elma Philanthropy Services, has been in this business for a while, and I'll request her to speak about her journey to this panel, if you will. And Renee McAlpine, who runs Opportunities Education Quality Program worldwide, is based in Kampala, Uganda, but has sat out the lockdown in her native New Mexico, and has just got news about Entebbe opening on the 1st of October. So I know she's excited to go back. So welcome, Tressa and Renee. And Tressa, if I may, if you could speak a bit about your journey and your interest in this area.
Sure, thank you, Atul. To help everybody who's not familiar with the Elma Philanthropy Services, I'll give just a tiny background on us. The Elma Philanthropy Services provides philanthropic advisory services to the Elma group of foundations, the largest of which is the Elma Foundation, which invests in organizations working to improve the lives of African children. So we are solely in the Elma Foundation focused on Africa. Our two portfolios are relevant to today's discussion, our early childhood development and what we call private sector solutions. In early childhood development, we're working to improve access to quality services in early childhood care and education for African children, most of which are already vulnerable through poverty or race or ethnicity in terms of marginalization, all with a view to setting them on a better life course. And then in private sector solutions, we invest in organizations and companies that are improving access to quality health and education for low-income families. And there we look for sustainability, scalability, and often for a willingness and an ability to partner with public systems to share information and techniques and initiatives to improve both public and private delivery of these services. In Africa in particular, we know that a large majority of health and education services, especially in large cities and urban areas and peri-urban areas, is provided through private means, and we consider that critical, and that's especially critical for low-income and marginalized families. In terms of myself, I've been with Elma for about 10 years now, leading the education work for 5 years, and as Atul said, none of us have ever seen this kind of disruption in education services, public, private, across the globe. And so it's critical that we continue to think about, not get bogged down in the despair of what's happening, but think about how we can work today and tomorrow to mitigate the impacts.
Thanks, Tressa. Thank you so much. Renee, over to you. Tell us a bit about your journey to your current role, and to talk a bit about what impacts you most in the middle of this crisis.
Right. Thank you, Atul. My name is Renee McAlpine. I'm the manager of the Edu Quality program at Opportunity Edu Finance. What we do is we focus on two specific areas of the low-cost private school sector in low and middle income countries. So looking at Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia, South Asia and Southeast Asia. And what we do is we support financial institutions, lend to the sector where there's a gap of financing and support for these independent community schools. We also work with the schools to support them in professional development, as they also don't have access to systems for training and support. So focusing specifically on school leaders and teachers, both for school management operations and teaching and learning. We also help schools evaluate their institutions and go through school development planning. So for those who aren't as tuned into school development planning and what that is, it's basically when you say education quality, you have to define it. What do we mean by quality? And actually make it practical for school leaders to understand, to implement, and actually drive change and improvement over time. So that's what we currently do at Opportunity Edu Finance, which is part of the Global Opportunity International family. And I've worked in international education my entire career in various aspects, you know, starting as a teacher in Cameroon, teaching English, having worked for BRAC for a bit as well, one of the largest NGOs in the world, you know, worked in policy for a bit at Brookings Institution, but have really found my home here at Opportunity, working directly with schools and school leaders, which is where I find the most inspiration in my day-to-day work, so.
Thank you so much, Renee. Thank you. Thanks to both of you. And as we go into now the questions and answers, let me just take a pause. So Tressa and Renee, you know, you spoke about it briefly in your introductions and the importance of education for children of these disadvantaged families. But traditionally, it has been many, many generations that children simply followed their parents' mode of work. And because most people were smallholder farmers, that's what happened. Over the last probably 1 or 2 generations, we have across the world understood the lifetime impact that good quality education can have on the well-being of an individual. So could you talk to that? Why is it so important to provide quality education to even the least advantaged children on the planet?
Mm-hmm. Sure, I can go ahead and start, Tressa. I often look at this, you know, why education, why specifically in the countries where we operate, where there's, you know, limited opportunity and low resources. I often think about it from a human rights perspective and also human capital, and I don't think about those as mutually exclusive. I do believe very strongly education is a human right. Without education, you know, a child's opportunity diminishes significantly. If you think about just basic reading and writing, and the, you know, functional aspect of being able to go into a bank and fill out an application for a bank account, and what that opens up for somebody, that's so fundamental, and you get that through formal education, right? And that's the minimum. And then you think about, you know, higher skills, and being able to navigate, you know, the economy and being able to develop jobs where jobs don't exist. That comes from formal education, and it should be an equalizer, and it should create that opportunity for everyone. And that really is a human right. So every person has the opportunity to achieve their full potential. If you look at it from a human capital perspective, people are the greatest resource that a society has. And it should be where societies and countries are investing in the development, which starts with education. You know, if you look at incredibly low resourced economies and countries across the world, they should be prioritizing developing their populace so that they can contribute to the development of those countries. So that's often how I think about it through those 2 different frameworks. And, you know, oftentimes you hear of those frameworks competing, but I see them as absolutely mutually exclusive, and you can't think about it separately.
Yeah. So they're codependent almost. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Renee. Tressa.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Renee. And I'd also say, as Atul mentioned at the beginning, that education is one of the best and only ways to break cycles of intergenerational poverty. The biggest predictor right now of a child's educational attainment is the mother's educational attainment. And that means we have to work extra hard to ensure that children coming from low-income families, who might not just be low income, but could be disadvantaged by other factors, that education has the greatest returns for those children. And I would add that early childhood education, beginning at an early age with holistic skills, early literacy, early numeracy, but also socio-emotional development, has the biggest return and the biggest return for the youngest children. And so these are critical services that should be available to all these children, and we should work hardest to ensure that those with the least access can in fact access them. The other thing I would add is that the earth is changing faster perhaps than it's ever changed before. I'm not a historian, so I shouldn't actually make that claim, but it's sure changing incredibly fast right now. When we look at the impacts of global climate change, when we look at the increased movement and mobility in global populations, especially children, when we look at some of the skills and competencies that we all needed when we grew up, they're completely different now, and they're going to continue to be different and evolved in the future. And that includes the generations that are in schooling right now, in education services right now. And that means we have to prepare them as best we can. And that means recommitting to the Sustainable Development Goals, but also to the localization of education and education services in each of these places. Thanks.
Thank you, Tressa. Thank you, Renee. I think, for both of you, your comments bring back actually my own story. And we haven't talked about it, but my grandmother was illiterate till the day she died, didn't know how to read or write. She insisted that my mother go to school and then to college, and my mother became a primary school teacher. To the exact point, Tressa. And then my mom insisted that her two children, go get an intense amount of education. And my brother ended up as a very senior leader at the World Bank as a result of what education he received, and here I am. So it almost is, what you just said, it brought back my own life story. So it's very telling. But and the difference that education makes. So to that point, then, let's come to where we are today. We all recognize the importance. We all recognize the progress. We all can see the impact in our own lives of good education. What is COVID-19 doing to education? Throw some light on that, bring to life for us what is actually happening and the impact of COVID-19 and these school closures on the lives of these children. So Tressa, if I may start with you.
Sure. So we're all tired of hearing it, but COVID-19 is unprecedented, and there's been unprecedented impact on the world's education systems. As Atul mentioned earlier, in April 2020 of this year, 1.6 billion children globally were out of school. And that's changed over the months as some countries went back to school, some have opened and reclosed, some have stayed out of school, but that's just an incredible number to contemplate. And the most obvious and immediate and deep impact is the learning loss. And the learning loss is greatest for those who have the least access and were already behind when schools stopped. If we think about not just the learning loss, but the economic impacts of this, World Bank has a variety of estimates, but their most common estimate is that of these children out of school, looking at a 5-month closure, for each student, that's a $16,000 loss in future earnings, which is $10 trillion in the global economy. And that's not something we can afford right now. So that's what's already happened. That's not to speak about what's coming with the global economic impacts in terms of how we know that social systems will be hit hardest as soon as we start, and we've already started to feel the global recession, the fiscal impacts. Governments will have less to spend on education. Aid agencies will have less to spend. Donors will have less to spend. And actually, I think something a lot of us forget or maybe don't know is that individual households often make the greatest contributions towards their children's education, even and sometimes especially low-income houses low-income households in African countries. And those households will have quite a bit less capital to spend on education and on their children. And so I think as bad as the impacts we've seen, there are worse ones coming. And then before I hand it over to Renee, I also wanted to point out that this is a crisis. Education's in crisis, but in many African countries, education was already in crisis. Pre-COVID in low and middle income countries globally, 53% of children under the age of 10 could not read or write. We already had major issues throughout much of our education systems in a lot of these countries. And so COVID is a further shock and potentially, hopefully, an opportunity, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, an opportunity to rethink some of what wasn't working previously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I don't have anything significant to add to that. All of that rings incredibly true to what we're experiencing in the field right now with the 1,700 schools that we work with. I would just like to drive home one point that Tressa made is many people talk about COVID-19 as this great equalizer, but I really think there's nothing further from the truth. I would say that COVID-19 has exacerbated and further highlighted the existing gaps that we see across every sector. If we think about education, probably in the United States, we see a bit of upward of 20% of children are probably not really learning right now during school closures. That would probably be upward of 80% in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries where we operate in. And so there's a massive amount of lost time where we're going to have to mitigate that significantly when schools reopen, restructuring curriculum, helping and supporting teachers to help catch kids up. And it won't be the immediate term. This will be a long-term recovery. I think, as Tressa mentioned, I do think it is good to end on a really good point here, is that we need to learn how to make this better, because the gaps that have been exacerbated here existed before and we knew about them. And now it's even more important that we address them and that we do build back better. I'm trying not to fall into the cliches, but we absolutely have to, because there's a lot to lose.
Thanks, Renee, and Tressa, you're so right. The problems, and in addition to what both of you touched on, is just the sheer fact that as the UN letter to the UN said, 300 million children were receiving midday meals, and they're without those. So the impact is beyond serious, with not only lots of education, but hunger and malnutrition causes both less brain growth as well as in terms of physical stature. So you're seeing a multiplying impact. Let's talk about, I want to have a two-part question next. All of us have governments, public authorities, humanitarian workers in the field. Both, I know your organization, Tressa, Philanthropy, has funded some amazing interventions. And Renee, you guys have been literally in the forefront. But talk to us about two parts. One, what have been some of the immediate solutions that your organizations are either doing or participating in? And then long term, because you can't simply do a Band-Aid on this one. And it shouldn't really be acceptable to any one of us that we simply do a Band-Aid. So talk about both those, and if you could. Tressa, let me start with you again, is both on the short term and then the long term. What do you see happening here in terms of the response to COVID-19?
Thanks, Atul. I have a couple responses to that. And as you pointed out, Elma Philanthropy Services supports a range of organizations working on this issue right now in education. Opportunity International is a strong partner of ours and one among several that we have. And so what we've seen has varied a little bit by whether the organizations are working with private schools or with public schools. But I would say the very most basics are the same, which is in the immediate aftermath and continuing right now to try and stay in touch with students as much as possible. Try and preserve a connection between students and their families and teachers and schools. And I say teachers specifically because teachers are incredibly important as schools are incredibly important. Schools provide connections to a social support structure, to emotional support, to as a community hub, as a place to exchange information, and as a way for families and communities to commune and check in on each other. And so what we've seen effective most immediately is to have a way to maintain those connections. In most of the areas we work, this is low tech. This is by phone, it's by SMS, and its regularity is important. So with a lot of organizations, that's teachers or a school leader or someone else from the school, regular check-ins, weekly check-ins with students, and more focused on how they are. And especially in the early months, just again, maintaining that connection. And then as time went on, figuring out ways to attempt to do some kind of distant or remote learning. And again, in these areas, that does not mean online learning the way we have seen it in much of America and some other places. Again, it means perhaps sending physical packs and finding a safe way to deliver them to individual families and students. It means perhaps SMS questions back and forth. It's that kind of solution, those kinds of solutions we've seen organizations rapidly develop and iterate on. And I'm sure Renee has even more concrete examples. But the last point I wanted to make is you brought up in the beginning is connections to girls and vulnerable students, and asking teachers and schools to pay specific attention and even more attention to girls and vulnerable students, knowing that they are more likely right now to be exposed to violence, to have moved from where they were living when they were attending school. So to track them down, to figure out what kind of chores they're doing, are they, where have their families asked them to step in, and how they can be supported to participate in any kind of learning right now. So those are some of the immediate solutions that we have seen many of our grantees and partners and implementing partners immediately seize upon and of course iterate as the months have gone by.
Thank you so much, Tressa. Thanks. Is there one example that really you got most excited about as you looked at the many things, or maybe one or two that crossing your desk? This is it's so out there, but it's you got excited about it.
Yeah, actually, I think it's a little bit unfair, but some of what I've been most excited about are things that Renee and her colleagues have been working on to stay in touch. And I just spoke mostly about students connecting to their schools and how that's incredibly important. But I think what Renee is about to talk more about, which I have thought is very exciting, is having a platform where small groups of schools can come together and support each other. Because I think we've seen globally that this is unprecedented for school leaders, and they really need to draw on each other for ideas and support, and thinking about what they can do to support their students and teachers right now, and having even very simple ways to constantly and immediately be in touch with each other through WhatsApp groups and other means has been critical for those leaders, and especially in areas and countries where they might not have been able to easily be in touch before this.
Thank you so much. Well, Renee, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, and thank you so much, Tressa, for the encouragement. It definitely hasn't been easy, but a lot of it has been rewarding. I think going into this, when schools started to shut down across the world, there are a few things that we absolutely knew based on what the challenges were before this happened, and of course, there's a lot of things we didn't know. And I think one of the most important things was to continue to adapt and continue to iterate as we were learning this new reality that we are entering into. But as Tressa mentioned, one of the most important things that we could leverage, things that we had really been putting a lot of energy into building before, was those relationships, networks, and communities, and really building on those for any kind of response work that we did. I pull a lot of lessons from the Ebola epidemic in West Africa from 2014, because in my experience, it was the closest thing that I had to this. There was a really, really disconcerted global response to that. And what you saw really drive home the results was community leaders going door to door and sensitizing people and mobilizing children to go back to school. It was so important, those community connections that people had to each other, to really, really drive home the final results, to really move past that. So thinking about that and the networks that we had created between schools, between school leaders, to share best practices, to really navigate through all of these unknowns was what we started with. So if you think about the use of technology, we knew we had to keep it simple. We weren't going to introduce a lot of new technology. We're going to use the current infrastructure that existed. So thinking about, mobile devices that were already existed and the delivery channels that existed on that. So WhatsApp, SMS, one-to-one phone calls, Facebook, which we know is in every corner of the world. There's also, television and radio, which was a really important piece during the Ebola epidemic as well, which we've seen ministries of education tap into incredibly quickly as soon as schools shut down, which is really, really promising. And the work that we've been doing, particularly at Opportunity Edu Finance, is using these different channels to support schools navigate this period of school closures. First, to keep their schools operational to the best of their capacity. It's not easy. After the first 3 months, their liquidity was at zero, and they didn't have a lot of options. And that was when the relationships were even more important than ever, is having those transparent conversations with their teachers, with parents and students about what the next 6 months is going to look like. And so the way we mobilized and the way we connected to school leaders and teachers is we created the Facebook groups very, very quickly to connect to everyone across our program. We also use existing WhatsApp groups to connect at a smaller, more intimate level with school leaders and teachers. And then we also had our same dedicated team of education specialists in the field calling their school leaders every week, if at the very least they're offering moral support and hope, which is a lot more important than people give credit to, especially during a period of time like this, when I think around June, a lot of people were beginning to lose hope because there wasn't any indication yet as to when schools would reopen. So I think our key lessons were to leverage community and connection that already existed, to build that even when people were disconnected from in-person support, and to keep it simple when using technology, use existing channels and infrastructure that was already there, to reach as many people as possible.
Thanks so much, Renee. Were there things that you did use, hindsight, you say, why are we doing this? We won't do this again.
Oh no, absolutely. I think everything that we're doing right now, we are learning from, and we are thinking about how we will continue to use it. In one respect, we know that technology isn't a panacea, and it alone isn't going to achieve the outcomes we want in education long term. We do really look forward to being in person again, which we know is critically important for social development and all of these other elements, especially those who have special educational and physical needs, where school was the only environment where they got the care that they needed. However, technology is now at the forefront. And I think our school leaders, who were very, very resistant to using it before, are now understanding that this is the future in a lot of respects, and the world is changing very, very quickly. And although it's not perfect, it does have to become an integral part of what we do. And so we've got to build the infrastructure. We've got to work together through massive partnerships to make sure that when this happens again, because there will be things that happen like this in the future. This will not be the last global crisis. The more connected we become as a world, the more we're going to share in crisis as a globe. And so we need to be prepared for the next one. And I really, really hope, I know us at Opportunity Edu Finance are going to build back stronger, and I really do hope others will as well.
Thank you, Renee. And as we now think about the longer term solutions that need to be put into place, to start with exactly what you said, what do we have now? And I think to me there are two factors here. One is, of course, you cannot have education without schools. So how do we make sure that schools stay in place both in the private sector and in the public sector? Two is that, especially for low-income families, the people who opportunity targets and really at the heart of the SDG enterprise is the willingness of parents to send them to their kids to school, especially girl children. So, let me turn, Renee, first to you in that regard, is that you have done an opportunities model really focuses on private sector, individuals and private schools providing affordable education. And we do that through sort of a unique model where philanthropic capital is used to really leverage local capital from local financial institutions, commercial players, market players. So it's a very market-based system that marries local capital available in the market with local proprietors to provide schooling, pretty much at the doorstep of these families. So talk a bit about the role of the private sector, the local private sector, and then the international private sector in making sure that these schools not only don't close, but stay intact and continue to thrive. We realize that, and I'm looking at the stat here, that 1.5 million private affordable education schools educating 421 million people today, children today. So talk a bit about the role of the private sector, both local private sector and international private sector, in ensuring that schools stay open, that schooling continues to be accessible to these children.
Thanks. That's a great question, Atul. I'll start first by talking a little bit about what we're doing during this period of time and why it's so important, especially for this sector that provides much needed access for a significant portion of out-of-school children. So the low-fee private school sector is a growing sector and serving, I think there's greater than 1.5 million schools in the low and middle income countries that we operate in. Over 421 million children currently accessing education in this sector, which shows, if this were to close down permanently, that would be a massive burden on the government sector, which is already at capacity. And so there's two things that we're really focusing on right now with our COVID-19. Two things that we're trying to avoid, and that is permanent school closures. So the longer schools stay closed, the more likely that it would become a permanent issue. And we're seeing that across, rich economies, middle income and low income economies across the world. They are businesses to an extent, and they do need to generate revenue to stay operational, to pay their teachers, to maintain their school campuses. And the other element we're trying to avoid here is children staying out of school permanently as well. As we know from previous crises, the longer children are out of school, the less likely they are going to return as they end up entering the workforce or early marriage and a multitude of other challenges that they'll face. And so what we're doing is providing very specific support and training to school leaders on how to keep their schools operational during this period of time, how to generate additional income and revenue generation ideas that they can do on and off campus during this period of time, of course, considering all the safety precautions in place and restrictions placed on by governments to flatten that curve, as they say, of COVID-19. And so this is a big focus that we've had since March to make sure that schools don't permanently close, so those 421 million children do have a place to go when schools reopen.
Thank you so much, Renee. Thanks so much again. The fact, okay, what can we do now? Give them the solutions to keep their schools open, the cash flows going, and even in some cases provide support to the teachers. And then in the long term, as you look at this, okay, what do we do? Continue to release both local capital into the marketplace so that the local financial institutions are willing to lend to proprietors, and that improve the quality of education within the schools through programs like what you run, so that parents are willing to send their kids to school. I think it's that sort of both hand, availability of capital to start and run the school, and quality education in the school, which generates parent willingness to pay the fee. It's just heartening to hear you tackle both sides, and I think that really is the two-part solution to long-term, if you will, sustainability and scalability of affordable education. So thank you so much. How do we make sure, what are they doing to make sure that schools stay open or return to being open, and what help and support do they need as they look to the future to increase availability of education?
It's an excellent question, Atul, and right now globally, ministries of education at the national and local levels are struggling mightily with this question. How to return schools to just pure logistically, how to open them again safely and competently, and get teachers back and students back. And that's a massive challenge in and of itself. But the secondary challenge that I think everyone is looking ahead to is what happens when schools are then physically open, given this gap, given this learning loss, given the anxiety and uncertainty that families and students and teachers are bringing back with them to the classroom, whatever they may have been through during these months. How do we deal with that? How do we think about socio-emotional learning and cushioning? And then how do we think about the very most fundamentals of how do we, I think many of the more innovative and the more innovative governments I've been in touch with recently and thought about recently are thinking about how do we very rapidly assess our students and figure out where they are. Doesn't especially matter where they're supposed to be, quote unquote, or what the curriculum says, or how old they are. The question is, let's assess them wide scale, rapidly, see where they are, and then focus on foundational skills. And there's a couple different interventions that exist right now. Teaching at the right level being one of the biggest and the best and the most well studied. It was developed by Pratham in India, but has now been tried in many different parts of Africa to great success to quickly get up learning levels. These kinds of programs, I think, are what governments hopefully will be focusing on in the immediate aftermath as students come back. And hopefully, as Renee was saying earlier, a little less focus on sort of overburdened and very sort of fraught curriculums that in many cases are more focused on memorization and pure information. And hopefully less of a focus on sort of high stakes exams that don't necessarily test competencies or life skills, but instead sort of test your memory. And so I think this is, as we've been saying, it's a bit of an opportunity, hopefully one that governments can seize to think about some of these larger scale changes. And the second part of that question, I would say the key word is partnership. I would say in African countries which is the geography I know best, there's been an increasing recognition over the past 5 years that ministers of education are charged with national education goals and education aspirations for their nation, their respective nations. They're well aware that they don't have the resources or, in many cases, the ability to fund and deliver that for every single child in their countries. And that's probably not what they should even be aiming for. They should be aiming for systems that best serve the most children in their countries, but well aware that there's already quite a substantial private provision, and it behooves them to work with private providers. It behooves private providers to work with ministers of education. It's going to take all these actors, public systems, private schools, non-governmental organizations providing quality services, faith-based organizations in many of these countries run large school chains. It's going to take all these different actors to pull together and offer what they do best, whatever that happens to be, to get students back and learning, and to get teachers back into the classroom. I think we haven't touched on this at all, but we don't know how many teachers are coming back and how many will be able to teach again, and what their social and emotional and economic situations are at this point. So I think partnership is going to be key to be able to deliver on the promise of education for all, especially those that have traditionally been shut out of these systems.
Thank you so much, Tressa. You're so right. And we had opportunity. We recognize the issue of teachers who really are paid employees of the school. So you've got the proprietors who want to keep the school open. Well, how do you keep the teachers employed and engaged so that they stay engaged teaching the children, even if it might be inadequate, but it's there, and have the cash flow to come back when the school's open. And we've been working on programs to actually provide, even to a degree, some amount of salary support for teachers to that end. Renee, I'm going to ask you, to the point that Tressa made about, how do you improve the quality of education in the classroom? And you're now dealing with both virtual, but a lot of your work has been actually in the physical classrooms, right? Your team does that for over 1,700 schools in Africa and rest of the world. Talk a bit about your program. What do you do to ensure that the quality of education being provided to these to students, is at a good level and keeps on increasing?
Yeah, thanks, Atul. I think on a normal day before COVID-19, you're right, a big part of our program was face-to-face training and support that we provided directly to school leaders and teachers. I would say the biggest challenges that we saw specifically in low-cost private providers of education is that often their teachers don't have access to professional development and formal training. So one of the greatest values that we could provide was really providing this foundational teacher training. So looking at the basics of how to manage their classrooms and how to deliver the lessons and achieve the objectives they want. Another core area of focus for us was also literacy. So basic reading and writing. For school leaders, our school leaders really run the gamut of their backgrounds and experiences. Sometimes they're from a business background and maybe they don't know so much about running a school, or they're a former teacher that they don't really know how to run school operations. So we covered everything from financial planning to teacher recruitment and retention, and the elements that would really help them run a successful school business. With COVID-19, the challenges became very, very acute as to what we knew the immediate need was. One, we needed to ensure temporary school closures didn't become permanent school closures, and that they were able to manage their cash runway for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months if necessary, so that they weren't faced with permanent closure, because where they're filling a gap for access for children was still incredibly important, as government systems do not have the capacity to take the influx of students that are currently being supported by this sector. The second issue that we were focusing on primarily is that when children were out of school, that also didn't become permanent. And so working with school leaders to both mitigate any challenges that would come up with teachers, and then also with students. And so that was being incredibly transparent and communicating very closely, as Tressa mentioned earlier, with both the teachers, the parents, and the students as to what was achievable during this period of time. And so our targeted intervention was supporting these stakeholder groups on using the channels available, using bite-sized, very practical pieces of content to reach them that they could use to engage their immediate stakeholder groups. So school leaders working with teachers, and teachers engaging with parents and students.
Wow, thank you. Thanks, Renee. What a story. Tressa, I know we're coming to the close here, but I would much appreciate, and I know the listeners and viewers would like to hear one story of your travels, your recent experiences that gives you hope in the middle of all this.
Sure. Well, like everyone else, I have not been traveling much recently, but just this year, just before COVID hit many of our countries in March, and sort of forced large-scale shutdowns, I had traveled in January and February to visit with some of our partners and some of the countries we work in. And just to name a few, I had visited with CAMFED in Tanzania and Zimbabwe, with PEAS in Uganda, with Opportunity International in Uganda, and then with some of our partners working on early childhood education, the quality of provision of early childhood, BRAC and PLAN and LABE in Uganda. And the hopeful note from all these experiences and all these organizations is that education works. Education, when children get access to good quality education, which can be public or private, to good quality teaching, when they're supported by their families and communities to attend, to enroll, attend, and stay in school, you see the difference year on year. You see girls graduating from primary and secondary and going on to find employment and changing the trajectory of their lives and their families' lives. You see young kids who have had the chance to have early childhood services and education in terms of early literacy, early numeracy, socio-emotional development, who can then show up to primary 1 or grade 1, having had that experience and not sort of starting from scratch with no idea what a pencil is, and never having seen a written text. And so I think that's the hopeful part. It's actually very quick, and very visible and very visceral when you see it in action. And that's why we all keep trying so hard, and why these families never give up on their children in any country. When there's education to be had and access to schooling to be had by some means, parents and families will go to any length to access it. And I think it's our global responsibility, our humanitarian responsibility, to ensure that it's there for them, and that at this point in this crisis, it will be there for them, and it will reopen, and we will all have the best, hopefully some of the best intentions in mind, but not just intentions, and we will have figured out and will be figuring out how to best serve these children. And on that note, I wanted to thank Atul and thank Renee, thank Opportunity International, the EduFinance team specifically, and as well thank Ideagen for hosting, for creating this incredibly important conversation on the SDGs and on education specifically. My biggest wish for us globally right now is that we recognize and globally recognize that how important education is, and put the effort commensurate with the challenge into it to ensure this generation has the best shot at the future.
Thank you, Tressa. Thank you so much. Renee, over to you. Share a story of your travels and what brings you hope. Sometimes we feel we're in the middle of a dark time, but there is lots of light.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. My colleagues in Kenya shared a story early on, after school closures. The lockdowns in many of our countries were pretty severe, and it had a really significant impact on communities. And there was a school leader who got all the teachers together to volunteer to go deliver meals to folks in her community, because people couldn't get access to food or public services. And it just really showed every individual has a role to play, I think, in this recovery and COVID-19. We all see how connected we are, how we're all responsible for ending this, and the spillover effects this is having on every sector of society. So it's my personal role when I step outside of my house every day, in what I do to stop the spread of COVID-19, what I do in my professional life to contribute to education as well, and then everyone else in every other sector. It's all hands on deck, and it will be for a while, so we can't lose sight of that. We need to take a break, we need to breathe, and we need to focus on ourselves to make sure that we are fully 100% there to build this, to build our societies back.
Thank you so much, Renee. You're so right. We all need a breather. So on that note, and so do the children and the families we serve. As we bring this to a close, let me once again thank both my very distinguished colleagues, Tressa Johnson from the Elmore Philanthropy Services, as well as Renee McAlpine from Opportunity International. For not only the experiences and the wisdom they brought, the stories of the solutions that they're developing and participating in, but really a enduring belief in humankind, both the parents who are suffering mightily, and the children who are not giving up. And as I look at this, what is happening in the space of education, coming back to that, we want to see a future where there is no child, if you will, left behind. Every one of those 630 million children is in school. And for us at Opportunity, we're very committed to seeing that happen through our education finance program, continuing to multiplier impact by very simple known tools of marrying philanthropic capital to local commercial capital, of bringing, if you will, the genius and the talents of our staff and multiplying that through small cluster groups of school proprietors and teachers and improving their effectiveness, both at running schools as well as educating children, working directly with the families to encourage them to send their children, especially girl children, to school, and making sure that even simple things like there are bathrooms for girl children. One of the things that Renee didn't mention, the Pathways to Excellence program that she and many of her colleagues authored, 30 different domains of expertise and practice put together, gathered from the world's teachers of how to run a school better, how to improve quality of education at the bottom of the pyramid. Things like that is what gives me hope. That for many of our viewers who grew up in families like mine, where one or two generations away, nobody was educated. But today, here we are on the global stage talking about how to make sure education is available for all, that many of you will find these stories resonate in your own lives. And that'll only improve and increase your commitment to making sure that there's a bright future for every child. Thank you all, and thanks again to George and Christian and the team at Ideagen for bringing this production to you, bringing this conversation to you. And I wish you well in your time at home or wherever you are. And as Renee said, take a break. We all need to. Bye for now.